It's not just an American issue. This is a Mexico issue. It's a Honduras, a Guatemala, a Panama, a Belize. It's issues for every one of these countries that's in between, us and South America.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to the Commstock Channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. It's always a pleasure to have you join us on these podcasts. Thanks again for being with us. Today, I am pleased to be joined by Bernt Nelson. He is with the American Farm Bureau Federation, and he is one of the main economists there at AFBF, and he's a regular contributor here from time to time. We have a very serious thing to talk about in today's episode here, Barrett. I'm hearing more and more talk about this issue with what they call the New World Screwworm that seems to be working its way northward from South America through Central America, and now it seems like it has crossed some barriers that have been established for many years in Central America, and they're working their way toward North America. This could be a real threat to the American livestock herd, couldn't it?
Yeah, this is a nasty little pest with a really nasty little name. And, it gets that name for kind of how it behaves. New World Screwworm, the way it works is the flies will lay eggs on a wound or a scratch or something like that on any warm-blooded animal. The eggs hatch, and then the larvae actually, they burrow into that wound. And this can cause a lot of problems. If it goes untreated, it can go as far as even death. And that's probably the main cause of concern when we think of livestock and the potential, disruptions and losses, be from the death loss associated from this thing. That's just the tip of the iceberg with this. Now, right now, we talked about, or you mentioned thresholds there for just a second. And I think that's really the most important thing we got to talk about with this, because how this has evolved is we eradicated this thing from the United States in 1966. Now, we eradicated it as far down as Panama by the year 2000. And we did this using something called sterile insect technique. Now, this is where flies are exposed to radiation and they are sterile, so they can't reproduce. These flies are then, millions and millions of them are released into the environment so that the eggs that are laid for the future also can't reproduce. So that's kind of how we end up pushing these things down, but it's a really slow process because it relies on that, that reproductive cycle. So managing to get them pushed all the way down to Panama by 2000, we kind of saw a little bit of a reemergence down in Central America, around 2021. Now, the first case in Chiapas, the state of Chiapas, Mexico, occurred in November of 2024. And since then, it's been kind of a race to control these things, with the only remaining fly production facility in existence in Panama. Now, they can produce about 100 million flies a week at max capacity, and then they're released into, strategic areas to try and push this pest back down. Well, there were some thresholds established where, as long as the flies remained within these thresholds, that we had enough sterile fly coverage to kind of handle the job. Recently, we had two cases outside of those containment thresholds, one in Oaxaca, Mexico, and the other in Veracruz. Now, the closest one here was about 127 miles outside of that threshold.
So it's moving northward, and I have heard some reports saying that if this continues unabated, let's put that in air quotes, that it could reach the southern U.S. within weeks and even theoretically the Canadian border by the end of July.
It can move fast. And I think that's one thing, that's one of the biggest threats here is there's nothing really standing in its way now. Now that those flies have broken through that threshold and there's no longer enough sterile fly coverage to keep them at bay, there's not really much standing in between them and the U.S. border. And so the way these flies travel, they can go around 10 to 12 miles kind of from a host. And so they, go say 10 miles and they get attached to a deer or any other amount of wildlife or livestock. They keep moving northward that way. We have to realize that cattle in Mexico, about 60% of them are still free-range cattle. They're not confined, they're not fenced in, so they have kind of a free-roaming ability. And so we have a very convenient medium for these flies to be traveling on. So they can make their way northward pretty darn quick. Now, there are some temperature restraints to these things. They don't really do well below 46 degrees. That's from the studies, that's kind of the temperature where they start to have trouble. But, I'm from North Dakota. It gets down to 20, 30 below there in the winter, but you know what? In the summer months, it's still around that. We've seen 90s, 100-degree weather pretty regularly. And so that tells you that they can survive during the summers and they can move further north. That means they're a problem for the entire country, and yes, even Canada.
If let's say a cattle herd gets infected by this New World screwworm, can they be treated?
So it can be treated. There's several things that are a few different compounds that can be used to actually treat it. And if left untreated, New World screwworm can typically be fatal. It can cause toxicity or cause the cattle to go septic, things like that within a couple of weeks. Because we got to realize what these do is they burrow into an open wound. That makes it even worse. So even after they're treated, say you use a couple different compounds to treat, you get the larvae out, you clean the wound, you still have an open wound that's susceptible to infection. And so there's a lot of risk posed here and a lot of maintenance required. And this adds considerable time, labor, veterinary costs, and even cost to the farmer over time when you think about this. And so there's a huge economic impact that can occur from this. Not only that, but when you think about human health, on rare occasions, this can be a problem for people. All it takes is a scratch in the right situation. I mean, it has been known to happen. They don't go after poultry quite as much. So birds and stuff, they seem to be a little bit more resilient, but still occasional hosts for this.
Wow, that brings to mind all kinds of horror scenarios. I mean, if you're talking about any other kind of animal, I mean, you mentioned deer. So what about like sheep and goats and rabbits and things like that? Are they at risk?
Absolutely. All warm-blooded animals are susceptible to this. And I think that's another point that we have to bring up as we talk about domestic. We've got more backyard poultry flocks now than we've had in decades. And so whether you may have goats, you might have chickens, um, any number of warm-blooded animals are susceptible to this thing. It really can happen to any one of them.
So it sounds fascinating to me. So about the only approach that seems to have been effective is to sterilize male flies and turn them loose. What do you have? You invite them all to a big party, or how does that work anyway?
It is kind of a cool process, though. So they're exposed to radiation, and that's what makes them sterile. So then, we breed millions and millions of these sterile flies. We load them up into an airplane, and then they are released in the air in strategic locations. And so they put them in places where they can kind of breed and keep the things, more sterile flies being bred and moved back down. So it's really used as a tool to push this thing as far south, and that's how we eradicated them in the beginning. In the United States, they were effectively eradicated in 1966. Now, we did have a couple of back and forth isolated outbreaks, between 2025 and 1966. We had one in Mexico, or not Mexico, excuse me. We had one in Texas in 1976. And we had another one in the Florida Keys, as recently as 2015. We were able to kind of act on those really quickly with this sterile insect technique. And when that happened, we were able to kind of eradicate them out within a year again. So this technique works, but it's really the only weapon that we have to eradicate this pest. And, when we think about what's out there, what the damage could be if this thing hits U.S. soil, there is a study out there. USDA ERS did an impact study. Now, they did this based on that 1976 outbreak that occurred in Texas. And so they took the 1976 costs, the operational costs. When you think what this does to the farmer, there's obviously a death loss that I brought up earlier. There is a loss associated with additional costs at marketing. You have to treat these things when you run through the marketplace. There's extra shots, medications, and things like that you have to do to get them through the supply chain, so you don't spread this thing into other herds. So extra precautions at the market, there's extra labor, there's extra fuel, there's extra veterinary costs, there's extra costs for medications and any preventatives, the pour-ons, those are the sprays we would use that you put on to kind of prevent insect issues. All of these things add up. And so this ERS study kind of put all these together, adjusted it for inflation. What they came out with was about a $1.9 billion annual impact just for that state of Texas alone. Now, Texas has a lot of cattle. When we look at around 12.5 million cattle, that's almost twice the other southern states combined. And so 13% of the country's cattle all in that one state. So that would be kind of definitely the biggest impact. But we think about that study, there's less people on the farm now than there were back in 1976. There's less labor available. We're talking about that constantly, how labor is a problem for the farms. Food animal veterinary shortages. There's not as many vets around as there used to be to service these cattle. And so there's all of these things are adding up to extra costs. And so while we talk about 1.9 billion, I mean, it's fair to say that that could even be conservative.
So what do we do? I'm hearing the problem is we can't produce enough flies. So how do we produce enough flies? Someone suggested that maybe some budget cuts are also worsening the situation. What do you think about that?
I think the solution really comes down to the fact that we have to put up a facility to produce more flies. That's just all there is to it. That is the only way that we're going to be able to push this thing back down to the biological barrier that was established in Panama. So no matter how we spin this, no matter how we look at it, no matter where the money comes from, we've got to get this facility built. It's not just an American issue. This is a Mexico issue. It's a Honduras, a Guatemala, a Panama, a Belize. It's issues for every one of these countries that's in between, us and South America. So there's something to be gained there, not only in the economic savings, but in the time that it takes to deal with this thing across the board. It is such a problem. It is a nasty problem, and it's really something that we've got to get after with regards to this facility. Because if you think about the time it takes to put up a facility like this, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to get a facility that has enough capacity to do this. These don't happen overnight, and so it's becoming a race against the clock to try and get something done before this pest makes its way to that southern border.
I have heard that one of the compounds that is used against this would be ivermectin. Is that true?
Yeah, there's some studies and anecdotal evidence of how ivermectin can be used and which dosages have been effective in this, and so they can give a shot of ivermectin. The kicker to ivermectin is, if you give an injection of it, if you think about it, it's not really as good. It's not going to kill anything that's on or flying around. It'll take care of what's on the animal itself. So if you give, a cow a shot of ivermectin, it's probably at certain dosages, there's a little bit of probably a 2-week residual effect according to the studies. But the only way that that's effective is if the eggs are laid on a wound and the larvae begin burrowing into the animal. They have to be exposed to it. And so while that will stop the larva, it really won't really stop the spread of the flies. So it's really just a single situation where you've got some prevention from a 2-week window from this occurring.
But it would keep the animal alive, I would think.
Certainly, in a treatment, there's several different medications that you can use to treat this. And while their names are kind of fancy and I can't remember all of them, there's a spray that you kind of use to get the larva out, and you have to clean it out. A shot of ivermectin would definitely prevent any reoccurrences, any other flies that laid eggs on it. It would definitely prevent any further damage from that happening, and that's where that really comes in treating the animal.
I guess the reason I bring that up is because there seems to be pretty high demand already for ivermectin. And I can see where that could easily overload that system, for the demand for the product,
It certainly is, but it's also a product that's been used a lot. It's very common in the veterinary world. It's readily available, in different anti-parasitic products. It's definitely something that production could be increased with if the need arises. So I don't think that would so much be an issue. In fact, down on the border, that is part of the crossing protocol for any of the cattle that were down there crossing the Mexican border, is that they had to receive a shot of ivermectin both on the Mexican side of the border and on the U.S. side of the border while they sat in quarantine. And so it's a pretty effective treatment to keep any flies that would be buzzing around, laying eggs. It would keep them from, really hatching and doing any spreading that way. So it's definitely a nice added layer of protection. I don't think we have to worry about any shortage related to it.
Is there any way to identify these flies versus your standard, horse flies and that sort of thing?
No, honestly, they look like kind of a standard housefly with bright red eyes. And so that's the way you can kind of see them. And I got a picture of it sitting right in front of me, to tell you the truth. And that's what makes them different. You kind of, some of these house flies, you see kind of a shiny little blue abdomen, but those bright red eyes really stand out.
So if somebody happens to notice anything that matches that kind of a look, what should they do?
I would try to get it in a plastic bag, and I would contact APHIS immediately. That would be what I would do.
How about their local veterinarian?
Local veterinarian would be a great source, and they could put you in contact with anybody at APHIS that'd be related to this. Your extension folks, your local extension service and educators, those are other great people that can, get the calls to the right place.
Good idea. Good idea. Well, I'm glad I had a chance to visit with you about this. As I mentioned, I mean, this could have a tremendous effect on an industry that already has a shortage of production when you're talking about the beef industry. But man, when you throw in everything else, it just could have a significant economic impact overall. So thank you for the heads up on that. And Bernt, if you don't mind, we'll keep a close eye on this through the year. I may check in with you if we have some new news updates.
Yeah, it's going to be a developing product, and we just put a market intel out about it yesterday. Take a look at that. The graphics on there that kind of shows the march of it going forward. I'll try to keep updates to that going as things progress, and we'll adjust it as needed. But that's kind of a nice little graphic that we put some time into that I really like. Shout out to our media teams at Farm Bureau because they did a great job.
Awesome. Well, I would encourage everybody to check out that information as it continues to be updated. Thank you, Bernt. All the best to you, Bernt Nelson, an economist with the American Farm Bureau Federation. Well, thank you for joining us once again. For producer Brianne Jenkins, I'm Marlin Bohling. We'll catch you next time here on the Commstock Channel. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.